Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Many of us have, at some point in our lives, had a minimum wage job. Usually this was when we were teens just starting out in the workforce in a part-time position. Well, in 2019, Canada only had 4.9% of minimum wage earners in their full-time job. But it can be very hard for Canadians to live off minimum wage, and for this reason, many provincial governments enact minimum wage increases to lift people out of poverty. But does this type of policy actually help or hurt Canadian minimum wage earners? Some argue that each minimum wage hike actually achieves the opposite, that it actually hurts the employee as their hours are reduced and that there are increased layoffs, thus aggravating the prospects of getting a job. So what should a minimum wage policy look like? Or should the whole concept simply be abandoned? Well, joining me now to share his research is Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. Hi, Philip. Thank you so much for joining me today. This, to me, is a very fascinating topic. I live in Ontario. This is always a topic of debate, especially around election time. So I think for our viewers' benefit, I think it's important to understand the concept of minimum wage rather. So could you explain what the genesis of minimum wage policy is and where something like this started, globally even?
Well, that is very interesting. Go back to the beginnings. That's always very revealing of the intent of a program. Minimum wage policy in North America started in the United States under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, and it was part of a deal that, in return for passing the New Deal, Congress held out. Congress at the time controlled by Democrats in the South. What they wanted was something that would screen out what are regarded as undesirable workers from the labor force. So they thought by bringing in a minimum wage, they would price out women, blacks, other so-called undesirables from the labor force, and that would maintain the male white monopoly on the labor force. It also deliberately excluded domestic workers. That was another pawn to the south. So it was always meant, it wasn't meant as an inclusive policy that would help people. In fact, it was designed as a policy that would discriminate against people. And, it's naive to think that a policy with those kind of origins would somehow evolve into an enlightened social policy. It's also quite revealing that a lot of very advanced, prosperous, enlightened, progressive European countries like Germany and Denmark and Sweden and so on, even Italy, don't have minimum wages or didn't until very recently.
Okay.
It really is a conceit of government that a problem can only be addressed unless we have a government program.
Let me just ask you, just for clarification.
Unconceivable to people that we could address a government program without having a government policy.
Okay, let me just ask you just for clarification. You said that the policy really had its first roots in America under Franklin Roosevelt. And you said it was to weed out quote unquote undesirables at that time. Unfortunately, that was how things were perceived. So is it by instituting a high minimum wage that's how it would weed out? How did that practically work?
But it certainly was higher than the going wage. I mean, that was part of the deal of Roosevelt. Roosevelt thought that he could end the Depression by restoring higher prices and wages. So he brought in a lot of programs like agricultural support programs, a lot of programs that would designed to legislate, to regulate prices and wages. And he thought by forcing those back up, he could end the deflation of the minimum wages. So minimum wage was just one part of a broad set of policies that Roosevelt brought in. Most of which, I mean, again, I'd go back to history looks back and says Roosevelt ended the Depression. It increasingly, though, a lot of people are saying it probably would have ended on its own anyways. And a lot of these actions taken by Roosevelt actually slowed down the Depression, but that's getting way off topic.
And you mentioned Germany, I think it was Sweden, Italy. Most of these countries, these progressive, if you will, European countries, didn't have or still don't have a minimum wage policy. What other countries can you name? Like, does China, for example, is there any other country?
Honestly, I don't know about the Asian countries. I suspect China and a lot of countries do have it. But, having a policy on the books and what it means in effect, it means two different things. If you have forced labor, if you have essentially slave labor, I have no idea what the concept of a minimum wage means. So I think a lot of countries, particularly in Asia, pass a minimum wage so they can go to international organizations like the International Labor Organization and say, look, we've passed progressive wage legislation, and it probably is a requirement
Right.
of a number of trade deals. But
Okay, well we're
I
gonna pick
really
this up.
question in force if it means anything.
We're gonna
Sorry.
pick this up right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're discussing minimum wage policy specific to Canada with Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. And once again, Philip, thank you for joining me. I really enjoyed reading your report. So let's specifically get into the Canadian context. So for our viewers again, who sets the minimum wage standards in Canada?
Well, mostly it's set by the provincial governments because it's provincial governments that regulate the workplace. There is a federal minimum wage, but that only applies to federal workplaces, notably the federal government and banks and federally regulated institutions. But most of the minimum wages in this country are set by provinces. And as a result, that's actually quite beneficial. Canada is a favorite of researchers looking at the question of minimum wage because we have 10 different minimum wages, and they are quite different across the country. They move quite differently. So we have a lot of different examples of different policies and what their impact is.
Okay, could you share some of the differences with minimum wage rates and policies coast to coast?
Well, there has been quite a divergence over the last few years. We've seen, in particular, Ontario and Alberta wanted to go to the quote very famous $15 that has been spoken about a lot in the U.S. and which has become an ideal in a lot of progressive circles.
Mm.
Mercifully, Ontario was stopped at $14 before Wynne could implement the $15. But Alberta's gone ahead with its plans for $15. So in those provinces is quite high. In other provinces, it remains relatively low at $10, $11. So, we do have quite a divergence. We have a couple of provinces moving towards. It's not just that the minimum wage is very high in Ontario and Alberta, but also it increased very rapidly.
Yes.
If you give firms a lot of time and say, well, we're going to bring this in gradually over time, and you give them a lot of time to plan, that's a lot easier to adjust to rather than the kind of shock treatment that we're seeing in a lot of provinces and in a lot of cities in the US, where almost overnight, the Biden administration, for example, as part of their the pandemic package just a few months ago,
Right.
they literally tried to double the minimum wage overnight from $7.25 to $15. Fortunately, it was ruled illegal by the person who determines these things in the Senate. But it's striking that somebody would think that doubling the price of something overnight would be a good idea. And
Right.
it's also quite revealing that sorry, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, you when you speak about the rapid absorption, if you will, by companies of such sudden wage hikes. I recall in Ontario, you were right. We were set to go from 13 to 14 to 15. I think 1 year apart for each. And
Yep.
I remember at that time I ran for the provincial leadership for the Conservative Party, and I remember this was a huge topic for us because businesses were crying out, we can't absorb this sudden jump and escalation. So. I guess, again, we always come down to sort of the roots of the problem. The reason that one wants to increase minimum wage is to help those, well, at least the bureaucrats or the government wants to help those who they feel are lower income and are the ones who are accessing lower wages. So does minimum wage actually, these increases, do they actually target low income households?
No, actually, raising minimum wages has almost no impact on poverty rates. I was just discussing, for example, how the Biden administration wanted to double the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage in the United States. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that even a 100% increase in the minimum wage would only reduce poverty by 3.8%. So you just don't get much bang for your buck. And the problem is that most people earning minimum wage live in households that are not low income. The majority of minimum wage earners in Ontario, for example, are teenagers living at home. So they're not, it's not doing much to address poverty. At the same time, most people who are poor because they don't have a job or they don't work a lot of hours.
Mhm.
a higher minimum wage isn't doing much to target these people. So it sounds very nice, and you can see why particularly trade unions really push the idea of minimum wage, because they're hoping that it has an incremental effect on their wages. But to sell this as a measure that addresses poverty is just false advertising.
Well, you bring up some interesting points here that, based on your research, it suggests that most of these are part-time employees and, for the most case, young people living with their families. So that, yes, in fact, they are young and perhaps they would be considered, if they lived on their own, as low-income earners, but they're being supported by their family members. But still, almost 5% of Canadians earn minimum wage as their full-time job. So there's something to be said about that, and that's based on a 2019 Government of Canada stat. So I think we're going to have to delve into this a little bit further to see what the benefits, if any, there are in minimum wage hikes. We'll be right back after this commercial break. Welcome back. Once again, we're discussing minimum income or low minimum wage policy hikes, policies and the hikes that we've seen come across province to province in the last several years. The intention is to help people to lift them out of poverty, but does that actually happen? And we're discussing this with Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. Philip, just before commercial, we were suggesting, or you suggested, that these hikes really don't target lower income households. So, again, the impetus for this kind of policy is usually, again, lifting people out of poverty. So does this policy actually achieve that, keeping in mind that 5% of Canadians who work as their full-time job earn minimum wage?
Yeah, well, a policy that's designed to help low-income people that only hits 5% of the intended audience is not a well-targeted policy. The statistics also show that if governments just stood back and did nothing, after 5 years, only 1% of all those workers earning minimum wage in the first year are still at minimum wage in the fifth year. So again, that shows that if government had stood back and did nothing, 99% of the time, the problem would have disappeared anyway. So people don't rise above minimum wage because of government laws. They rise above minimum wage by working, by showing up, by being more productive, by having a healthy, thriving economy. So there's a lot of ways you can help low-income people, and we should be doing things that target low-income people. The problem with minimum wage, it just doesn't target very well.
No.
It's like trying to control a pandemic by locking down the whole city when you just have a pandemic in one neighborhood.
Right. No, that's an interesting analogy. In your report, you made a suggestion that it's a sign of failure if large share of employees earn minimum wage. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, I suggested the ideal place to bring in a minimum wage is Alberta. For example, in 2014, the Alberta economy was so strong. You'll remember there was such a shortage of workers. We were bringing in temporary foreign workers from other countries, that there was such a shortage of workers in Alberta that only 1% of Albertans were earning minimum wage anyways. We had such a strong labor market, the minimum wage had effectively been abolished.
Right.
That to me that's what I want. That's how I want to get rid of poverty. I want to, not by raising minimum wages, I want an economy so strong that employees are in such demand that employers voluntarily, on their own will go out. But on the other hand, if you do like Ontario and you impose a minimum wage and 10% of workers are earning minimum wages, you're giving an incentive to employers to invest in capital. The famous kiosk, for example, you go into McDonald's now and you punch in your order to a machine. A worker doesn't take your order anymore. So that's the risk when you impose it on employers. They'll react in a way that actually frustrates the very goal you're trying to achieve.
And frustrate the consumer, I might add. Sorry, I prefer dealing with a person than those terrible machines, but that's okay. Maybe some of our viewers enjoy that. No, and I think you bring up a very good policy, and I very much remember those days in Alberta where I remember someone at Tim Hortons, the minimum wage was, I think, pushing $20 as a drive-through attendant, and I thought, wow, it sounds like Alberta's the place to be if you want to make some good money. But you're right, they had a shortage of employees because they were booming, because the economy just kind of took care of itself, if you will. Perhaps, and actually, and that's something that we should address. You mentioned about these other measures employers will take if they're forced beyond their means to increase, especially rapidly, minimum wage. You suggested automation of jobs or basically laying off employees. That does happen. There's also cutting back hours. You mentioned a few other things in your report. Do you want to share those?
Yeah. Well, the first reaction almost always is cutting employment. I mean, there's a very strong consensus in almost all the research in Canada that a increase of 10% in the minimum wage leads to job losses of 3 to 4%. And that's especially concentrated amongst young people, the very people who we want to help get started in the labor market. You mentioned off the top that your first job was at minimum wage. Mine was too, working in a parking garage. I mean, I think that's where we all start.
Right.
And but we all understand too, this is not the beginning of a lifetime of earning minimum wage. This is building up a resume. And you show people, I can show up on time, I'm honest, I don't steal from the till. And then the second job becomes easier, and gradually you work your way up the ladder, and that's how people progress up the ladder. It's not by being legislated up the ladder. So the employment costs are quite significant, but over time, employers will cut back on the work week. And in the very longer run, they'll substitute capital. They'll start automating jobs. And we're seeing a very strong push for that because of the pandemic has
Right.
really accelerated that process. So
We're gonna
particularly at
we're
this
gonna pick
moment in
this up.
history,
Sorry to
yeah,
cut you off. We're gonna pick this up. We've got to cut to a commercial
sure.
break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on minimum wage here in Canada and some increases that may or may not be happening and what we've seen and what are they actually beneficial? Do they actually lift people out of poverty and help those that they're targeted to help? Well, joining me to finish this discussion is Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. Philip, just before we went to commercial, we were discussing some of the measures employers may feel they have to take to absorb the sometimes sudden, increases in minimum wage, these minimum wage hikes. You mentioned further automation. You mentioned cutting back on hours, sometimes layoffs. One thing I've noticed is sometimes full-time staff will then be relegated and reduced to part-time staff. Is this a phenomenon you've noticed as well?
Oh, very much so. I mean, there's a big incentive for employers, given that their mandated wage costs have gone up. What they do is they substitute part-time workers for full-time workers. Full-time workers have to be paid a full range of benefits, health benefits, pensions, and so on and so forth. Part-time workers, you don't have to pay these. So it's a way for employers to keep a lid on their total labor cost. It really doesn't matter to the employer whether he's paying wage or non-wage benefits. It's all the same cost to him. So if you raise the wage costs on one hand, you're giving employers a big incentive to cut back on the non-wage benefits, and that's exactly what we see happen in practice.
And frankly, perhaps some of the employees, if given a choice, would you like that extra dollar in minimum wage or do you want to hang on to some of these benefits? They may choose the latter. But with these instituted policies with wage hikes, then they don't get that choice. It's kind of a top-bottom situation. So that's an interesting thing. Okay, but we do have minimum wage in Canada. That's not going away. We do have it. So is there ever an ideal time for governments to enact a minimum wage hike?
Well, there's no question that when the economy's strong, we just talked earlier about the example of Alberta. Alberta in 2014, at the peak of its boom, that was the ideal time to introduce a minimum wage because, frankly, nobody was earning it anyway. So it had almost no impact. It wasn't raising costs. In the few areas it did raise costs, the economy was so strong the employers could pass on the higher costs through higher prices. So that's definitely the ideal time. The worst time would be right now. The economy is struggling. The small business sector especially is struggling. This is the last time you want to be imposing additional costs on employers. A lot of employers, especially small businesses, are fighting for their life as it is. If anything, this would be a very good time for governments to think about actually reducing the minimum wage. I mean, this is something the Ford government could do to help out employers and to help boost employment because, restoring employment I think has to be the number one priority. If governments, down the road feel the need to try to boost the outcomes of low-income workers,
Right.
governments should do that themselves through tax credits or things. But don't try to pass this off. Attaining a social goal, by asking employers to pay for it. If we as a society think that low-income people deserve to be subsidized, then we as a society should be ready to pay the price and pay the taxes to do
Right.
that. Don't ask firms to implement social policy. It's immoral, and frankly, it doesn't work because firms end up doing things that end up frustrating the implementation of the policy anyways.
No, very well said. I can't imagine any government right now wanting to claw back any minimum wage rates. But I agree with you. I think there are a lot of, well, we know that there are a lot of people unemployed and a lot of businesses are struggling. So I can't imagine that it would really have that much of an impact anyhow as people hopefully soon return to work once this latest lockdown is over. But are there any provinces who were supposed to have a minimum wage hike and then said, you know what, we're going to hold off until we get through this pandemic?
Well, perhaps you're right that Ontario isn't ready for rolling back minimum wage, but we could think about doing what Alberta did. And what Jason Kenney did was he said, okay, I'm going to put up with Rachel Notley's minimum wage, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back the lower rate for students, for
Right.
younger people, because those are the people who are most likely to lose their job anyways, and those are the people who we are trying to help get a foothold in the labor market.
Right.
So maybe rolling back a minimum wage for 35-year-old waitresses is too much for we as a society. But, I know when I was earning a minimum wage as a student, we had a lower rate than adults
Right.
because, frankly, young people are just less productive. Ask any employer. Give me the choice. Do you want to hire a 15-year-old kid or a 35-year-old adult? They're going to take the 35-year-old every time. So the only chance kids have of getting a job in this labor market is at a lower minimum wage. So
Okay.
maybe we can at least talk about that.
Well, we'll have to see what the future holds in this post-COVID world. Thank you so much for all of your insights, Philip.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion, especially with the history of minimum wage. What we do know that in Canada, that these increases, based on what we've heard from Philip Cross, they don't seem to actually help those they're intended to. So if they don't work, well, we have to figure out what is the solution. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.